Willkommen. Meine Damen und Herren. That's all you're going to get from me in German. So I know a little bit more, but not too much more. So my name is Jim Garrett. I am the Senior Director of Product Strategy and Planning for Harman's Luxury Audio Group. If you're familiar with the Luxury Audio Group, so we manage all of the high-end brands that are under the Harman portfolio, JBL, of course, being one of them. So we manage all the high-end JBL loudspeakers. We also manage JBL Synthesis home cinema systems, Mark Levinson, Revel loudspeakers, Lexicon home cinema processors, and Arcam electronics. Those are all part of our family. And as I mentioned, so I manage the product development, product strategy for the brands, and was certainly heavily involved in the development of the L100. So what we're going to do today is kind of give you a little bit of background on what we did with this product. There's a tremendous amount of history that we have on the pro side, on the studio monitors, the original history of the L100 throughout the 1970s. So we're going to go through some of that. I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about the current engineering team that we have based in Northridge, California, so you can get a little more insight into the people that are behind creating the L100 Classic. And then we'll give you a little bit of what's going on with the brand today. I do have a short video that hopefully I can show to you here at the end of this as well. And then, of course, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. So, everybody set? Good? Okay, so we're going to take a trip back in history here to start off. So, where did we come from with all of this? So, in a case of, we'll go this way. So if you think back into the late 1960s, so what was changing in the world of music at that point in time? This was really the advent of loud guitar-based rock and roll. So bands like Led Zeppelin and The Who and Deep Purple were becoming very, very popular. And if you think about what was going on with live music at the time, even think back to when the Beatles were performing live and they were playing these large stadium events and they had nothing more than the amplification that was on stage. And so oftentimes you could not even hear the band over the crowd noise that was in there because it just wasn't loud enough. There was no way to project the sound of the instruments out to the audience in there. So this is the dawn of tour sound and the type of products that we know today. And of course you take it for granted when you go to a concert today, no matter how big the venue is, even in large football arenas with tens of thousands of people in there, the sound's probably going to be pretty good. But that wasn't always the case. And so JBL was certainly a major player in the early days of that. If you even go back to the Grateful Dead, if you're familiar with The Wall, one of the most famous PA systems that was out there, that was a combination of JBL transducers, primarily 15, 12, and 5-inch transducers that were used, nearly 600 of them, as well as Electro Voice tweeters, Alembic cabinets, Macintosh power amplifiers. And it really kind of set the stage for what would become the modern tour sound system. So, but back in that day, JBL products were selected because at the time, Altec Lansing, of course, the Lansing part of that is the L from JBL, as most of you hopefully know, James Buller Lansing. And what JBL was doing was far more robust drivers, larger voice coils, they would handle more power, they were more reliable, which was a critical thing to have back then. We even became the OEM supplier of transducers to Fender. So all of the Fender guitar amplifiers that were back in that period of time were using JBL transducers. So that change in the industry necessitated a change in recording studios and what was happening. So now you had engineers that are recording this new rock and roll, loud music, and needed more capable products to be used in the studio. So you can see here beside me, Capitol Records in Hollywood. This was a studio where they used JBL 4320s, and it was a very capable loudspeaker. A lot of the same attributes that we had in the live sound is what we were going to gain in the studios as well. So you can see that there. That's a 4320, which was one of the most famous JBL studio monitors at the time. In fact, the entire 4300 series that was in the late 60s and early 70s, some of the most famous studio monitors around. But as things were starting to change here, consoles were getting bigger, there was more equipment coming into the studios, and that necessitated a need to have a more compact studio monitor. So that kind of forced the creation of the 4310. And this now kind of sets the stage for the beginnings of all of this. So the 4310 used a 12-inch three-way footprint in a considerably smaller cabinet. You can see here on the right side a 4320 next to a 4310. And so this allowed us to have the transducers or the loudspeaker placed a lot closer, now often on top of the console, as opposed to soffit mounted as they had been before. And this was the studio monitor that really became the studio monitor and kind of set the stage, the iconic white woofer that we had in here, that three-way format that would become ubiquitous throughout history on it. Also, you can see now that we had moved the attenuator controls to the front panel. So this was another situation where now that the speaker was a little more accessible, it was easy to get to the front, but you couldn't often get to the back of it. So where the controls were located on the back of a 4320, we moved them to the front on the 4310. So that's a little bit of history about where we came from there. So what happened next? So if you think about the timing in here, so this is roughly around 1969. So JBL was about ready to change ownership. And it was going to be purchased by the Jervis Corporation, which later became Harman International. It's Dr. Sidney Harman, of course, acquiring the brand at that time. And so he came into the situation where we now had what was basically the top studio monitor speaker on the market. And we had a lot of these engineers that were taking the product home and using it in their home because they loved the way the speakers sound. Thought it would make a great hi-fi speaker. But that's never really what it was intended for in the first place. It was developed as a tool to be used in the studio. And that included the cosmetics of it as well. So the early 4310s, if you've seen one in person or even the picture I just showed you, were kind of this really coarse gray paint finish on them. Not designed to be attractive in any nature. Again, it was just simply a tool to be used in the studio. So at that time they said, maybe what we should do is just make a consumer version of this and let's put it into a much nicer enclosure. Let's give it a better grill. Let's give it a nice walnut veneer cabinet finish on it. And so that's exactly what happened, and that was the original birth of the L100, at that time also known as the Century 100. And the grill, of course, is going to become one of the most iconic features of this. And this was something that, with having the product in a little more consumer guise, wanted to have something, since it was a basic enclosure, that would draw attention to it in terms of the look and the design. And again, keep in mind, this is 1970, so if you're thinking about style and trends that were popular then, why were the grills orange? Well, your carpet was orange as well, so this would be part of the reasons. So we thought about microphone windscreens. And that same material was something that could be then utilized to do a sculpted grill on the front of the product, but still be having the acoustic properties that we'd want to have a good sounding loudspeaker. And some of the original challenges were, how did we get the color into it? And it was actually one of the engineers in the factory that finally figured out the way that once we had this sculpted foam, that we could paint the colors onto it, which gave the ability to offer multiple color selections in the grills. So initially you can see the orange, kind of a burnt orange, and the blue and the brown. There were several other versions of it that would eventually come out. There were red grills and black grills and things like that. So that became certainly one of the iconic design features of it. It then became immortalized. Anyone remember this advertisement? So probably one of the most famous ones, the Maxell Blown Away ad. And this is the L100 at that point in time. So again, thinking of the time period, one of the most popular loudspeakers out there. If you saw, there's an actual video version of this as well, Ride of the Valkyries that came in there. So a great ad that really immortalized that loudspeaker for us. So what would then go on to happen is, if you look at historically, so again, we came from the 4310. That's where we started this whole thing out. And as the L100 was developed, there were improvements made to the 4310. You can see, of course, in the baffle design, that was one of the things. And we also flipped the speaker upside down because it wasn't designed to be sitting in a console configuration. It was designed to be used at home. So what happened then was the improvements we made in the L100, we turn around and put those into updating the studio monitor. They became the 4311. And then the L100, well, the things we had learned on improving the 4311, we improved the L100 again. So you can see here basically kind of a snapshot of the various configurations that we had of each of these speakers, starting off in really basically 1968 with the 4310, all the way up to 1978 when the original production run of the L100 was concluded. So you'll also see that there's quite a number of transducer configurations in the way they were arranged on the baffle. And the original L100, you can see, was in a vertical arrangement. That ended up into kind of this angled version that was one of the more common configurations found on most of the L100s. This was also a time where, remember, these were considered bookshelf speakers. So I don't know anyone that currently has a bookshelf large enough to contain one of these things, but that was the case back then, of course. And it was often a case, too, where the speaker wasn't necessarily standing up. It was often laid on its side. And when you look at that last image there, you can see even the badge on the product was designed for it would be laid on its side, and that's how you'd read L100 Century on it. So that would be the configuration that was there. They were not offered in that time in any sort of mirror imaged pairs. When you bought a pair of them, you got exactly that. So times are changing, and now what you're going to start to see is the rise of floor standing loudspeakers as people's homes are changing, the way we're living is changing, loudspeaker tastes are changing as well. So when you get into the mid-'80s, you can see the L100 then became the L100T and took on a more traditional floor standing footprint in it. That then led to a subsequent variation of it called the L100T3. It came out in 1988. So why is this particular one important? The gentleman on the right that you see there, Chris Highend, started working at JBL around this time period and was the engineer behind the L100T3. So you can see this is an image of him in our Northridge facility. At the time, we used a location up on the roof as a ground plane measurement where we would measure large transducers. In this case, the 12-inch woofer that was featured in the L100T3. So, Chris Highend, there's one aspect of this we're going to talk about a little bit more. But let's move into talking about the team and the facilities that we use. So again, that image taken at our facility in Northridge, California. And let's talk a little bit more about what's happening there with that today. So we are still in the same facility here. The logo has changed, of course, on the front of the building a number of times now. And currently, if you're familiar with Harman, so we are a wholly owned subsidiary of Samsung Electronics. But what we have maintained is complete autonomy. Nothing changed for us in terms of our leadership, in terms of our engineering, in terms of our facilities, or any of us that work on these brands. Nothing changed from that standpoint. So we continue to work in this facility that we've been in for decades. There's an amazing amount of history here. Any of you that are ever out in the Northridge, Los Angeles area and want to stop in, we would certainly invite you to come have a look around. Tremendous history in there. And what you're looking at now are some images of the team. So our brands that I mentioned at the top that we manage are part of what we consider the luxury audio business unit. So we are a specialized business unit within Harman that functions only on those brands. We have our own dedicated engineering teams, marketing teams, product management, training, everything that's specialized around serving these brands. So what you see here is the team, and you'll notice again, the gentleman on the top right, there's Mr. Chris Highend that's working with us again. So couple more images here. So again, you can see some of the facilities that we have in Northridge, but to get into that a little bit more, we have tremendous resources at our hands. Very blessed to have this and somewhat unique in the industry as well. So this is just in the Northridge, California location. Within our luxury audio business unit, we also have 2 more engineering facilities for electronics, one in Connecticut and one in Cambridge, UK. But this is where all of the acoustic development is done. It is also still the location where JBL Professional is all designed and engineered. So we are co-located with all the engineers doing the current tour sound products, musical instrument, MI industry products, general sound reinforcement. All of that is also developed. They have their own engineering facilities in the same building. So what you're seeing here is a lot of our portion of this. So Anechoic Chambers used to measure loudspeakers. Not a tool that a lot of companies have, but we have 5 of them just on this one campus. You can see in addition to that, one of these images here. So we have 3 large format arenas. So when we start to get into some of the big pro products out here, those are things that take up a lot more space. And so we need a bigger area to use those. And actually, when we go beyond that even, we have a ground plane test facility that's used outdoors. So when we're doing even larger systems, our neighbors love us when we put up a full tour sound system and play it at full volume out there. So yes, we've had the police called on us a number of times. So in addition to that, multiple electronics labs, multiple listening rooms that are in there. We have the ability to build everything there with a metal shop, a wood shop, rapid prototyping that's found on site, power test lab. We have a pro experience center that's a complete showcase for everything we do on the pro side. And then on our side of the business, we also have the John Ergel Theater, which I think is one of the finest JBL synthesis consumer theaters that you can be found anywhere. So these are the types of tools in the environment in which we develop these loudspeakers. This is the team that's working on them from Luxury Audio. So this is our portion again. This is the Luxury Audio engineering team that is based there in Northridge. So Brian Schultz, who just celebrated his 30-year anniversary with the company, is leading the acoustic engineering team. You can see Chris Hagen there as well. Onwin, Armando Martinez, Chris Hagen, Mark Glazier. These are all guys now that are 25, 30 years tenure with the company. So when I mentioned that nothing has really changed for us in what we're doing today, that should certainly indicate what's going on with our brands in there. You'll also see that in terms of the disciplines that we manage, again, a lot of unique things that we do. We develop our own transducers. We don't go buy transducers off the shelf, we develop them. Onwin is one of our principal transducer engineers, and we can develop every aspect, whether it's a tweeter, a compression driver, a mid-range, a woofer, active electronics as well, is all done in-house. Project managers, mechanical engineers. This is just the engineering team. Then there's an entire product development team, part of my team that goes along with this. So let's talk and bring you back a little bit once more to Mr. Chris Hagen. So you can see the tenure here. Chris is currently the principal engineer for JBL loudspeakers, part of our team. I would say he's on his second tour of duty. So you can see the original time that he was with JBL Consumer, 1988 to 1997, and that was the time, as I mentioned, that he did the L100 T3. He went astray for a little while, so found his way as the manager of engineering for M&K Sound, a brand I'm sure you're familiar with. Then moved on to be, it says acoustic engineer there, but he was the only acoustic engineer that they had at Velodyne. So he led the development of a lot of the Velodyne subwoofers during his tenure there, which was where I met him at that time, and decided that he needed to find his way back to his home at JBL. So I was lucky enough to convince him to come back and join us, and he's been with us then ever since February 2014, and you can see in his current role as principal engineer at JBL. So he was thrilled to be working on these products again. Timing-wise, one of the things that came up here was the 70th anniversary of the JBL brand. And so we wanted to do something special to honor and celebrate that monumental occasion. And we, at the time, of course, if you go back to the history that I showed you on the slide there, the 4311 eventually became a 4312, which has gone through approximately 9 different versions, all with some suffix of a letter at the end of them. So 4312B, and you get your way all the way up here, D, E. So we just released the G as the current version. Prior to doing that, what we wanted to do was to do a limited edition version of that product, and that's what you see here, the 4312 SE, or the special edition, was done to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the brand. So we built these with special badging. We had a 70th anniversary logo that harkened back to one of the older 60s era and 50s logos that we had for JBL. Came with a unique birth certificate and things like this. And so it was a great product, and this was something that Chris developed for us. Well, what was happening as we were doing this was kind of starting to think, just as we had in the very beginning, you know, man, the L100 kind of came out of this whole thing anyways. And as we were digging out some of the older products to do some development, we dug out a pair of the Century Golds. So the Century Gold was the anniversary speaker that we did in 1996 as the 50th anniversary, and as its name would imply, was a throwback to the original L100. So here we are again, the classic 12-inch three-way configuration. So that was a product that was done in limited edition, 1996. It was not inexpensive. It was $5,000 a pair US at the time. And that was something we drug out and did comparisons with the 4312 SE. You can see where that was leading us, of course. So we said, well, now's as good a time as ever to bring back the L100. And we just went with the pro side, right? Of course, in today's day and age, products like the 4312 SE are not used in professional studios. We use them on the consumer side of the business. So they're used for hi-fi systems all throughout the world, but there's a tremendous love affair with that design and a romance of that 60s and 70s era loudspeakers. What they're doing on JBL Professional now is completely different products. Of course, in the world of studio monitors, everything has moved to active products, and there's a lot more technology that's being used as opposed to kind of the throwback design of that one. So, if we were going to bring it back, we could update it. That was one thing we can do. So what you see here is some of the original concepts and inspiration that we had in this. So as we started discussing it and thinking back about what was special about the L100, what are the things that everyone would remember about the product? Well, certainly the look was one of them. And we said that's a place we could go back to. And so we started going back and looking at designs based around that grill and said, let's base the design around there. You can see some things were similar to what an L100 was. We looked at designs that could sit on the floor. We looked at designs that were perhaps a little more compact, but even not square. And we make something round and a little more modern looking. We put some angles on the cabinet. We rounded the edges. A lot of these things that were some interesting ideas, but we didn't feel really did justice to what the L100 was all about. So when it came down to it, what we decided was, well, the look was important. So what we did was make it pretty much look exactly like it did then. The idea behind the design was if the speaker had not gone out of production in 1978 and continued on, what would it have done? So we said, well, let's just keep on with the way it was. This is the part of the loudspeaker that everyone remembers. This is the part that people have fond memories of. They loved it. They liked the look of it. And we also found ourselves in the current time period where retro styles are very popular. People are looking for that piece of their history and something that would remind them of perhaps better times, but the times of their youth when they were listening to rock and roll and going to school and whatnot. So we decided we would keep that. Now, one of the things, of course, we did was change the foam. So the foam was made of a completely different material than it was back in the day, and better acoustic properties. And when we went back to the colors, question that perhaps came up earlier ahead of this, we decided let's go back to some of the original colors. There were at least 5 colors we could choose from. And we decided that in today's world, black, of course, was always the safe choice. We wanted to do the orange because it certainly fit the throwback look of the product, and it's JBL orange, so that was one. And then we thought for the third color, the blue would be good. We changed the blue slightly, although they look identical on the slide here. If you look at the original color of the blue, the new one is a little bit different. But we thought these would be kind of fun colors. Weren't sure how well they would sell in today's day and age, but as we've come to find out, the orange and the blue are considerably more popular than the black, which was exactly the opposite of what we thought we would have. But I think it speaks to the retro nature of the product again, and that look with the walnut wood veneer on the cabinet and the orange grill, it just looks pretty good. We do sell a lot of the orange, yeah. With the orange was a product that we thought would be certainly eye-catching. It would instantly get people's attention with it, and so we thought it would be kind of the launch color, if you will. And then, maybe nobody's going to buy it, because who's going to put an orange speaker in their room? Well, we couldn't have been more wrong in that aspect, so, and I'm happy to be wrong about it. So while we kept the product looking the same, and again, you really can't see much difference there. There's a size difference between them, but if you look at it, 1970 to 1978, 2018, pretty much looks like exactly the same speaker until you get to what's inside the speaker. So in this respect, while we wanted to go very much retro, old school with the look of the product, we wanted to have very much a modern loudspeaker. There's a tremendous amount of acoustic technology that we had at our hands in the Northridge facility, and so we thought, let's bring this thing up to date in terms of using acoustic technology that wasn't even available back in the 1970s. So you can see some of the changes that we've done. This is also a fairly good slide. These are not entirely to scale, but they're about 98% to scale, I would say. So you can see immediately one of the things we did was to make the enclosure size slightly larger, which we did that because we knew we wanted to have a little better low-end response. So when you went back to that 4310, at the very beginning of that, the 4320 was a much larger enclosure and had a lot more low-end capability than what a 4310 did. But that was one of the sacrifices made at the time in order to have a high-output, compact studio monitor. So we decided, well, that size constraint was not something we necessarily had to live with. So we made the enclosure a little bit bigger. Then you can also see the difference that's in the high-frequency drivers, the port that's used on the front of the product, the mid-range, the woofer, everything is considerably improved over what it was in the day. But we maintained that iconic 12-inch three-way configuration, and we maintained the white cone woofer, which was one of the key identifying marks on the product from the beginning. The enclosure itself, we wanted to go back and have a very solid foundation for that. So the idea was to build a much better cabinet than what we would have had originally. And you can see here in the X-ray view, there's a big V-brace right through the middle of the cabinet. You can also see that the mid-range has its own sub-enclosure. And so it's a very well-built product. And so that having a good solid foundation in terms of the cabinet was key to us making a good sounding product. The other thing was thinking about the size. So if you consider, again, this was a bookshelf speaker back in the 1970s, and again, it's really a little large in terms of a bookshelf speaker in today's day and age, but it's also, conversely, too short to be a floor-standing loudspeaker. So we had a dilemma on our hands now that we really liked where we were headed with this thing, but if you were to sit it on the floor, the tweeter is down at your knees, and if you can't put it on a bookshelf, because no one has a bookshelf big enough to support it, either its size or its considerable weight. So what we decided was, let's make a small floor stand. Back in the 70s, for a time, there were some walnut wood stands that were made by JBL and sold as an accessory to get them off there. But what did most people do? They put them on milk crates or concrete blocks or something like that to get it off the ground. So we wanted to put it onto a riser for two reasons. One, to get it up to the height we needed to, but it also would allow us to lean the speaker back. And so what we wanted to do is to configure the angle so that when the speakers were in a traditional listening position, that the high frequencies would be up at your ears. So that's why we did what we did. And you can see this was one of the final experiments where we had in order to try to get the tweeter up to the right height and leaning that back on the stand. I think it's added considerably to the retro look of it. I like the fact that the speaker kind of floats off the floor a little bit. And if you happen to still have shag carpet, you can see the lovely green or orange shag carpet underneath the speaker. So back to the acoustic technology again on there. So there's a lot more going on in this product than there ever was in the original. The tweeter is certainly the most obvious one. The original L100, certainly in today's day and age, if you were to ask people about it, what would you say it is? Well, it was a loud rock and roll speaker. That's what it was designed for. Well, we knew we were going to have that stigma, but we didn't want to necessarily have it just be a loud rock and roll speaker. We wanted it to be a great musical loudspeaker, no matter what type of genre of music you were going to play on it. It should be an audiophile loudspeaker. And so from a technology standpoint, that's why we used and made a lot of the choices that we did. So you can see up at the top, 1-inch titanium dome tweeter with an acoustic lens waveguide around it. So that is a radically different high frequency configuration than what the original had with a roughly 1.5 to 2-inch paper dome that was used for the tweeter. Below that, you can see there's a 5.25-inch, 130 millimeter cast frame polyplast mid-range that, as I showed you on the X-ray view, has its own sub-enclosure so that it does not interfere, or rather the woofer doesn't interfere with the mid-range in there. The port, if you notice on those original products, very small port, no flare on either end of it. That type of design can be very noisy, certainly at high volumes. It can lead to chuffing. And what we wanted to have, again, with the increased volume that we had in the larger enclosure size, was to have a lot of bass responsiveness with the bass reflex design. So we used our patented slipstream geometry, which if you were to look at a section view of that, there is we have a patent on the curvature that's used in there, but it basically eliminates almost all of the noise that you would have out of the ports at high volumes. So just out of sight here in this image, of course, we stayed with that white cone in terms of the woofer, but as you saw in the previous slide, there's a considerably larger motor structure that's found on this driver right now. A big, heavy cast frame, larger voice coil than what was in the original. So we have considerably higher power output capabilities with that than what we would have had with certainly the original transducers that were found in the product. And one last thing I'll mention too, the L-pad attenuators that are located there on the front. So the original L100, I don't know this with all conviction, but we believe it was the first product that offered attenuator controls on the front panel for a consumer product. And that was simply a carryover from what we had on the studio monitor version. So, but that was another identifiable characteristic of the product that we wanted to maintain. So we kept the L-pads on the front, which also gave us a lovely little area to put some branding on the front of it. So we maintained those as well. So you still have the HF and mid-frequency level attenuators that are located on the front of the product. The other thing that you can't see there is the crossover network. So in the original L100, the woofer was basically run wide open. There was no crossover network on the woofer. And what was on the mid-range and tweeter, not nearly up to the standards of what we would do today. So again, trying to develop this and aiming for an audiophile type sound signature in it, there's a considerably more complex and more performance-oriented crossover network that's used among the three drivers. Another question that came up earlier, we had some time to discuss these things in the hallway prior to the presentation. So why are the drivers located where they are? So if you'll notice, the configuration we did today was back to that vertical configuration that you saw in the original L100. So when they took the product and flipped the baffle upside down to a consumer version and put the tweeter on the top, where we think it all belongs today, that's what we did here. But the challenge was that port tuning that I just mentioned to you required a much larger space on the front baffle than what we would have had with just a continuous straight cylinder port across the front. So that forced us to shift the mid-range over a little bit. Now, we could have simply just gone back to the last version of the L100 Century and done that kind of angular version of it. But acoustically, that again did not fit the goals of what we were trying to do for a high-performance loudspeaker. So we wanted to stay with that vertical driver arrangement, which forced us to put then the tweeter over a little bit, but that again had the benefit of creating a space to put the L-pad attenuators on the front. So we could have then mirror imaged the cabinets, but we chose not to do that from that standpoint. It's certainly a visual thing. You could say, well, I would like to have these pair matched, but then people are like, well, it has to sound different. Well, the reality is it doesn't. The wavelengths that these drivers are operating out of, if you think about the portion of the wavelength in terms of the distance that those drivers are offset, it makes zero difference in terms of the acoustics, which we measured when we were doing it. So that was the reason we decided to leave them offset the way they were and just have both of them there, because there would have been no benefit. Yep. Yeah, so the G, which is the newest version, does still have a left and a right, but you figure about the way that that baffle is configured, the mid-range and tweeter are set side by side. So they were off so far. Now, we did that for two reasons. One, we wanted to allow that speaker to still be laid on its side, which this one we didn't really intend for that to be the case. So when we did that, now, depending on which way you've laid it, left or right, the tweeter's either on the top or the bottom. So you're going to have some boundary interference with it, of course, if it's on the bottom. So you want to put it on the top. Well, then if you flip the other one the same way, the woofers are offset. So they are mirror imaged in that case. The 4312Gs and the SEs were also, specifically the SEs, were sold in matched serial number pairs. So there were two in a carton. So it was easy for us then to manage having the left and the right both in the same carton. L100s, which are larger and heavier, are only done in single cartons. And so it was going to be a challenge then to make sure that everybody got, I got two lefts, I got two rights. So again, coming back to the fact that it didn't matter acoustically, we just decided, let's just make them all the same. So that's what we did. Now, if something were to change, right, if we made a smaller or a larger version of the speaker and maybe the tweeter had to be pushed even further off to one side or another, then maybe we would make a mirror image pair again, because then it would matter. So again, decisions that were made in terms of the ultimate acoustic performance of the product. So at the end of the day, what did we end up with? So what we ended up with, again, that retro design, we wanted to maintain that. That was something that we knew would grab the same amount of attention today as what it did back in the 1970s and have the most modern sound possible. We wanted to make this for people that love music. That's all this was really about. Is it the most accurate loudspeaker in the world? No, I'm not going to claim that it is, right? From its price point, one of the things we did on the pricing was to basically maintain the pricing of what it was back in the 1970s. When we first announced this was another thing that people mentioned. It's like this is US pricing, by the way, $4,000 a pair for these. That's an awful lot of money. We're like, well, keep in mind that 20 years prior, they were $5,000 a pair, 20 years prior. And if you actually do the math and account for inflation, the original price of $278 a cabinet in 1970, that was not an inexpensive loudspeaker, even when it was originally developed. And if you do that math, it roughly turns out to the high $3,000 range anyway. So we basically kept it at that same kind of price point. But what we've done now is to make it a speaker that anyone could listen to any type of music that they want on it and really have a great sounding loudspeaker, but still have the fun part of the design. It's really why we're all in this part of it. And I think we can often get lost in trying to have perfection in terms of loudspeakers. And a lot of times that can tend to take some of the fun out of why we're doing this in the first place. We do this because we love music. We want to sit down, we want to relax. Music can change our mood, it can relax us, it can take us back to thoughts and memories from times long ago. It's something we can share with our friends. And so that was a key part of this was, let's have something that makes people want to do that and not have them sit there and say, I think I need different cables, or maybe an amplifier should be different because I'm hearing something down. It's like, really? Yeah, we offer products that you can do that on. That was not a design goal of this product. And as you can see from some of the initial reviews that we had, there's Mr. Chris Hagen again. He's a proud papa, so he's very proud of this loudspeaker and was really thrilled to be able to work on it. But you can see the type of reviews. The product's been available for about 9 months right now, and the reviews that we're getting on it are pretty consistently 5-star reviews. We've won a number of awards for it. It's been featured on several magazine covers already, and it's doing, again, what we thought it would do. The picture that you see there on the top right, I was at the Expona trade show in Chicago, which is the North American rough equivalent of this show, certainly the largest hi-fi show in the United States right now. And as we were working the show that day, this is Frank and Angie that came walking into the room. Who are Frank and Angie? We never met these people before, and why are they wearing JBL L100 fan club t-shirts? So as we got to talk to them, it turns out they certainly are much younger. They would have never had an original pair of L100s back in the day. And it was just a product that did exactly what we thought. It appealed to them from the look of it, and when they went in and had to listen to it, they instantly fell in love with the product. And have now found themselves in a situation where they're inviting their friends over and listening to music. And heaven forbid, they're actually sitting down and listening to an entire album from start to finish, as opposed to consuming little chunks of songs here and there. So they decided they were just going to start their own fan club and try to get other people that were excited about the L100. So that's the type of response that we're seeing from everyone on the product. So a really great thing to have. Don't take my word for it. We're here at a show. The product's here at the show, so it's the best time in the world for you to actually come listen for yourself, see what this product sounds like. So we're located over in Hall 4 on the atrium level. So we're room F119. So there's a picture of the door. Sure, working your way. What's the closest way there? I would say staying on the bottom, all the way down to Hall 4. Go immediately up the stairs when you're in the Hall 4 atrium. Turn right, go all over the far hallway, left, and we're 4 rooms down on the right side there. So if you're standing in the atrium of Hall 4, Kef, that's facing into the atrium, the back side of their room is facing the front side of our room. So if you found your way there, keep going. And I'll mention the Kef room because they're also showcasing our cam electronics in their room too. So have a listen in there as well. So that's where I would certainly invite you to come in there. We've got a number of products in there, Mark Levinson electronics that we're using to power the system. There's 2 different systems. Our new integrated amplifier on the right side, the number 5805 that was being used with the L100s. We do have our Revel F228BEs there, and you can see a pair of JBL K2s. So depending on what's happening at that time, you'll hear one of those 3 loudspeakers in there. But we have been focusing on the L100s for it. So, all right, I do have
this is not a retro speaker brought back to sell a retro speaker. This is a modern speaker that is built to modern specifications, and it's gonna rock the world.
I'd say excited could be an understatement. I remember this iconic speaker from back in the 80s. There was an old commercial that featured it.
It's the iconic speaker from the Maxell ad in the Blown Away ad, and everybody remembers the martini glass falling over.
The original L100 came out in 1971, And it was a derivative of the 4310.
We found that engineers were taking these speakers home and using them as their home hi-fi.
They realized, well, the 4310 doesn't look that great at home. Let's make a nice looking piece of furniture for home. And the first L100 was born.
I'm always kind of skeptical when we try to bring back classics or do reissues of them, but I think in this case they did a very good job. And behind the orange grill, it's all modern and there's nothing embarrassing about the sound. It sounds great.
This was a product that has so much heritage, and JBL is all about the heritage, and it's a product people want. They love this stuff.
We previewed the speaker back in January at CES, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. The stories that people have about this speaker, the love affair, the romance around it, and some people were just like, yes, wow, I love it. It was that type of response almost every single time, going, man, those sound great.
So we were able to take this really favorite speaker by a generation of people, and now that we figured this is a great time to re-release it, but with an update of its acoustic technology.
The development team that worked on the L100 was a pretty broad swath of people from the product standpoint. Actually, the chief engineer for this particular project is one that had worked on the L100 T3 back in the day. And our industrial design team really had a lot of fun digging back into what we had done historically. But how do you do a modern take on that without really losing a lot of the identity that the product had and a lot of the factors that make it so instantly recognizable to people?
It's one of the few models that when you think JBL, most people think L100. They may not know what it's called, but most people remember the grill. Whereas the new version grill has dyed plastic, so the color is actually part of the plastic. There are no solvents involved, and this grill will last longer. The cabinet has a new V-brace, which we've used in much more expensive models in the line, but where we've really improved it is in the high frequency tweeter area. We're using a real dome tweeter that's titanium with a soft surround, and also in the woofer area, but the network is completely different. And we've had people come in and listen to it that used to sell the old L100 and say, oh my God, this image is way better.
We're seeing a lot of the people that maybe dreamed about buying the speaker when they were in their youth and knew about it. Maybe their dad had a pair, maybe their best friend's dad had a pair. Well, now they can get a pair and they're going, oh, I want that speaker. I remember that speaker and I want a pair, and wow, it sounds really amazing.
I remember seeing the original L100 in Pacific Stereo when I was a kid. I never thought I'd actually do a new one.
Chris was very proud. And he gets a little emotional when we have this loudspeaker out. So that is the conclusion of my presentation. And at this point in time, we have a couple minutes left. So if there are any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them. We've got about 5 minutes left. What do you think? You like the product? You want to go have a listen to it down there? Again, straight down to Hall 4, up to the second floor, over to the right side. So F119. So certainly invite you all to come have a listen to the product. Again, it's one of these things where people have an expectation of what they think it's going to sound like, and then when they sit down with it, we just had the editor of Stereophile magazine from the US that came in and listened, obviously someone that was very familiar with a large number of loudspeakers and certainly the history of this one, and he came back and he's like, I did not expect it to sound that good. So it shouldn't sound that good. It's like, well, it does. So I'm happy you like it. But yes. Well, the foam, of course, in terms of the grill itself, was the design and the iconic style, so that we wanted to maintain that. But as if you remember some of the originals, when we mentioned that they were painting those grills, is what they tended to do was dry up and crumble away. And so if you look today on the used market, a lot of original L100s don't have their grills anymore. And part of that was the simple process of them putting the color on the grill. So we changed the process, the manufacturing process of how we create the grills and embedding the color into the foam that's used on it right now. So it is a much more environmentally friendly version and should last considerably longer than what the original ever did.